Yes, so today I'm going to talk about my idea of a speculative, namely especially new materialist aesthetics. And as I have had a hard time to shorten my talk, I will directly jump into it. So I structured my talk into three main sections. Firstly, I will try to give a brief overview of the field of speculative philosophy. Then I will jump into the way speculative philosophy deals with the aesthetic, and I will argue why I see precisely new materialism as a particular sub-branch of speculative philosophy as especially apt to grow a new aesthetic. And as a third section, I will basically subsume my position, and I will give a hint into to what I think should be done and what I myself am trying to do next. So let's get started. What is speculative philosophy? As such, I define a certain, still minoritarian, but truly upsurging branch within the realm of contemporary philosophy that is united by the claim that philosophy is bigger than the human look onto things. Speculative philosophy hence is united by the aspiration to show that philosophy exceeds what Meillassoux famously titled correlationism, and what Debes even widens in scope when he calls it the anthropocentric paradigm. I'm citing Debes. It is not really so much a rejection of human beings as of imbuing mankind with a particular function. To this, a speculative philosophy counters that it indeed is possible to research reality itself, hence the nature of reality. So whereas canonical philosophy puts epistemology first, speculative philosophy aspires to revive ontology, namely of a realist kind. And the means by which it wishes to access this ontology is speculation, hence its name. So let us take a closer look into the field of speculative philosophy. So far, I detected four main sub-branches: speculative realism, speculative narration, object-oriented ontology, or in short, OO, and new materialism. Now you can play around a little with these four fields, for instance, by attributing distinctive scholars to them. Here, I think that two personages especially stick out, namely Meillassoux and Graham Harman. Meillassoux is one of the original members of speculative realism, yet Dolphin and Van der Taan, they also call him as one of the main new materialists. And Harman, he is a founding member of speculative realism, but he also founded a school himself, namely OO. And in addition, he also wrote, for instance, the foreword for a main book written by Debes, who is one of the founders of speculative narration. Other ways of distinguishing these four schools is their geographical location. OO is completely US American, speculative realism mainly US American, with Meillassoux being French. New materialism is half American, half European, and speculative narration is completely based in Brussels, so it is really a European manifestation of this new trend of thought. Besides, new materialism can be seen as the feminist branch of this sort of philosophy, and OO truly is a male-governed sub-branch. What is more, speculative narration, realism, and OO all were founded in the beginning of the 21st century, and it is even that speculative narration and OO share the year 2002 as the year of their origin. And here I'm really focusing on this because also Ian in his talk said that they would all be located or have origin in the 1990s, which indeed is not true, because in fact, it only is new materialism that has been founded in the 1990s. It was in 1996 that De Landa defined his thinking as neo-materialism, which is a term that was taken up and turned into new materialism by Rosi Braidotti in exactly the year 2000. I would like to complete my overview with some further additional information about these four schools. So speculative realism aspires to become an overarching term, and here has even a canonical tendency, which I, however, see as dangerous, especially because it only scarcely mentions in its primary works the field of new materialism and speculative narration. So what makes speculative narration special is that it draws speculative philosophy into empiricism and pragmatism. And interestingly, speculative narration explicitly distances itself already from speculative realism. What is more, speculative narration also keeps a loophole open to distance itself as well from the brick speculative. Again, as the Bess writes, abandoning the term speculative is not necessarily the right solution. It might, however, become necessary. O is mainly based, or at least the founding of O was mainly based on phenomenologist Heidegger, and in contrast thereto, new materialism, like speculative narration, stem from the field of philosophy of sciences. Besides, where speculative narration draws especially on the method of narration, Barrett, as a new materialist, rather created her concept and method of diffraction. However, both concept, narration as much as diffraction, can be detected to be Deleuzian in kind. Barrett built diffraction on the basis of Deleuze's description of the fold as a wavering, and narration is a fabulation which Deleuze described already as the art of the poor. So when it comes to the aesthetic now, what should be expected is that both camps deal with it differently. Also, and especially because this field is seen as rutted by a distinction about what Bryant, Schwinnecek, and Harman call the basic persona of the world. New materialism, for instance, holds as such the relation which Braidotti defines as enmeshment, Barrett calls the entanglement, and Delander, in a rather Deleuzian way, calls the assemblage. In contrast thereto, as the name of the school already tells, object-oriented ontology holds as such the object. When speculative philosophy confronts philosophical aesthetics, what they find basically is what Shalley, in his correspondent entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, subsumed to 4 aesthetic ixes. Hitherto, aesthetic was either defined as an attribute of the object, or as an attitude, experience, or judgment of the human. I think that this 4 petition can basically be subsumed to 2 aesthetic stances, namely the externalist versus the internalist aesthetic stance, whereby already by the quantity of its positions, the internalist so far repressed the externalist aesthetic stance. So let's ask, what will and what can speculative philosophy do with and for the aesthetic? As a matter of fact, O, as a representative of speculative thinkers, can only work against the canonical view held today that the aesthetic attribute rather is an attribution, hence the Kantian judgment. So O can make indeed the externalist aesthetic grow in the attempt to level externalist and internalist aesthetic. However, for me, the question remains open how to research the aesthetic if it is located in an object that is defined as withdrawing. In contrast thereto, new materialism is a relationalism, and as such, I think that it can reconcile the 4 aesthetic camps, because it is capable to reel all hitherto aesthetic ixes as partial. On the one hand, it can show that the internalist aesthetic stances can be aligned to a process. We have to hold a certain attitude in the sense of a readiness or openness in order to then experience something in a certain, namely aesthetic manner, and eventually to judge it aesthetically or as aesthetic. On the other hand, new materialism can also show that externalist and internalist aesthetics are mutually dependent. It certainly is the case that the object, when it comes to the aesthetic, very often is dependent on the human, but I think that also the human is dependent on the object. Eventually, we have to approach, experience, and judge something as aesthetic or aesthetically. And the aesthetic camp that is mostly denying this thought certainly is one of the aesthetic attitudes. In this vein, the internalist aesthetic becomes rather reactionary and hence probably even secondary in kind. So I think new materialism can throw a fifth aesthetic X into the shark tank of philosophical aesthetic, namely the relation. Thereby, it does not need to circumvent, reject, and neglect, but it can rather bundle together hitherto achievements and read them affirmatively. It does not need to limit itself to a singular one of them, but it can truly read them through one another. Thereby, it could show that the human might even be more dependent on the object than the object truly is for the human, for the aesthetic to evolve. Because if the aesthetic is a relation, then also such relations are thinkable that are aesthetic, yet in which the human is not involved. Or as Chavira already said, when there is no cognition. So when speculative philosophy is capable to grow a realist aesthetic, new materialism can refine the stance by a relational realist aesthetic. However, so far we just said what different speculative philosophical camps can do with and in the aesthetic. Let us now take a look into what do they actually do and what did they do so far. Strikingly, new materialism so far really hardly touches upon the issue of the aesthetic. Only Karen Barrett merely sketches a Levinas-inspired ethics-aesthetics querying approach, and thereby sketches an aesthetics of care and responsibility. However, crucially, when it comes to the aesthetic, object-oriented ontology becomes relational. To clarify, O does already a relational realist aesthetic. To further this claim by some of quotes, Harman defines allure, which is how he defines the aesthetic, as a theory of causal relation in general. Morton describes the aesthetic as the ways in which relation between beings play out. And Chavira, who is not precisely an object-oriented ontologist, but certainly a speculative realist, in his blog Pinocchio Theory in 2009, he wrote an entry which he titled Object-Oriented Aesthetics ? And therein he wrote, aesthetic is not just a human attitude, but a primordial form of relation and interaction. So what I do is, I wonder, do these object-oriented ontologists not contradict themselves? Do they not betray the object as their unit of thought in growing such a relational aesthetic? Or else, how can Harman promote the aesthetic as first philosophy and continue to make an ontology which is based upon a hierarchization of objects over relations? I wonder, how do these two claims really go together? Besides, I think that in this regard, the story of speculative aesthetics takes an unexpected turn, because object-oriented ontologists, in doing such an aesthetics, equip the aesthetic with the power to reconcile speculative philosophy's basic persona discussion, because they grant the aesthetic the chance to persuade them from the relation. If the aesthetic achieves to be successful in this regard, I think it here has the possibility and opportunity to gain a higher prestige also within philosophy in general. So let me briefly subsume my position. Speculative philosophy is a realist ontology, yet therein two camps were defined. Object-oriented ontology, for instance, does an object-based realist ontology, and new materialism, inter alia, does a relational realist ontology. However, in the process of establishing itself as proper and encompassing philosophical program, speculative philosophy sooner or later has to confront the issue of the aesthetic. As such, I hold that the aesthetic will be a particularly hard to crack nut, because hitherto the aesthetic was not only unquestioned as a matter for epistemology, thanks to Baumgarten, but even as a particular kind of epistemology. Yet I think that what speculative philosophy can achieve is an ontologization of the aesthetic, based on the premise that the aesthetic is not limited to the human, but wider, namely existent in excess, as Nick Land already said it. I personally see this as a soothing as well as exciting thought. I think that it is soothing because if it really is the case that the aesthetic is out there in the world, then it is not a rarity, but it exists in abundance. And I also see this as an exciting thought because we now have to re-ask ourselves, where else can we detect aesthetic relations that so far we were unable to see? So what should be done next? In the direction of speculative philosophy, I think we need to make new materialists realize that object-oriented ontologists have done their work already. And vice versa, we have to make object-oriented ontologists realize that they have moved out of their thinking in doing a relational realist aesthetics. Yet I think this can be a chance for new materialism and OOO to close ranks, to focus on their shared aspirations, whereby I hope speculative philosophy can be strengthened, crucially by means of the aesthetic. On the other hand, in the direction of the aesthetic, I want to align myself today with Shaviro, who said, what's needed is a more nuanced and varied account of aesthetic modes, which would work mainly or simply by listing and describing. I think we really have to work now empirically. Where in between can we spot the aesthetic? How do aesthetic relations happen in the sense of how do they evolve, what makes them materialize, and why do they pass? And here, my connection to the panel and also to Ian's previous talk finally reveals itself. I think that for this undertaking, what I call the clothing practice is the most suiting accomplice, because whereas artworks pretend borders where there are none, thereby reinforces the thinking in entities, and thus also the 2 or even 4 partition of the aesthetic, the clothing, which I see as a particular kind of human thing relation, is a closest and most continuous relation, which makes the borders blur. For this reason, I want to grow my relational realist aesthetics by means of the clothing. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Swantje, for this wonderful talk. Now I would like to start a discussion. Feel free to ask directly or because I do not see any chat messages. So, okay, Nick.
Thanks. Look, this is really interesting stuff and a theoretical approach with which I'm completely unfamiliar. So I'm really just going to ask you for some clarification here, just to help me understand what's going on here. So, I mean, the slide that you had that outlined what object-oriented aesthetics has done so far had 2 or 3 quotations on, all of which seemed to be very general to the extent one might think that they're too general. So saying that aesthetics is the study of causal relations in general, that doesn't seem true. That seems too wide. Or that it's the study of relations between beings in general, that seems too wide, because that should also encompass morality, politics. So, given that, I take it that part of the art here is to narrow our account of what kind of relation is at stake when we talk about the aesthetic, because it can't just be relations in general or relations between beings. And that seems to leave us with 2 sorts of options when we're trying to be more specific about what the aesthetic is here. One would be to theorize the relation and leave the objects to care for themselves. So we think of the aesthetic as a particular kind of relation among objects of whatever kind. Or we think of certain objects as being aesthetic, or having some aesthetic nature, and then we let the relation between them come as it may. So I wondered, I mean, this all sounds like, very, very, it sounds like I know what's going on here, but I don't know what's going on. So could you tell me whether the direction you see this going is more towards sort of theorizing a kind of relation as specifically aesthetic, or theorizing a kind of object, or is there a third option that I'm just misunderstanding here? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. I do think you kind of got the gist already. Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, let me first respond to your claim that it is quite a general way of talking about the aesthetic, and that it would be too wide and stuff, how Severo, Morton and Harman already talked about it. I think on the one hand, what they're really trying to do is to expand the aesthetic and reopen it up again, to let more things count as aesthetic as before, and to really make the aesthetic exit the human realm. So on the one hand, I do see why they are talking like that. On the other hand, I do agree with you that this cannot be all that the aesthetic is about, because then what is the aesthetic? It kind of runs through our fingers, and it's going to be everywhere and nowhere at all. And this makes it then a very hard to research topic, or maybe not even a topic at all. So I really think that this intersection, if we call it an intersection between speculative philosophy and philosophical aesthetics, that this intersection is really just forming itself right now, and it's kind of brand new in a way, or yeah, kind of new at least. And I think that we really have that more work has to be done there. And interestingly, when I rethought, or when I'm rethinking these quotes, I came to the same question, and also to precisely the same formulation of the question as you did it, namely, what kind of relation then is the aesthetic? And then I feel, okay, but if we are talking about what kind of relation, then we are also contradicting these programs of thought, because what especially no materialism works against is a nominalization of existences. And if we talk about a relation as a noun, and then we just specify different kind of relations, as I also done it in my PhD, but I mean, we are all in the process, and we can rework our own thoughts, which is I think a good thing. And yeah, then I think asking or formulating the question in the manner, what kind of relation is the aesthetic? I feel that this is not going to work. And right now I'm really searching for a different way of accessing the aesthetic, if it really is an issue for ontology. And what I so far came up with is really the processual account. I mean, Deleuze, for instance, who is a speculative philosopher, he writes that all relations in reality are processual becomings. So when we're talking about aesthetic as relations there, I think we really have to treat it as really becomings, and maybe even forget in the end again also about the concept of the relation, because relation is something can also be quite static. And if we see the aesthetic as an assemblage sort of becoming, then we can ask the question that I closed my own talk with, namely, how does it become? What makes it evolve? What happens in there? And what makes it pass as well? And where do these agents or facets or knots, however you want to call it, that so far have partaken in an aesthetic assemblage, where do they go next, and what happens to them? Do they remain in the aesthetic in a different assemblage? Do they exit the aesthetic and insert some dynamism into this kind of aesthetic thinking? Did I kind of answer your question?
Yes, that's either clarified or obscured things, but either way, it's progress. I think other people have things to say, so I'll shut up.
And yeah, also because you sorry, but I just want to refer to the second thing you said, the theorization of the relation and or theorizing the aesthetic either as a relation or as an object. I think what is really going on in the field of speculative philosophy right now is a kind of misunderstanding of their own missions, and I think this makes this aesthetic in the speculative philosophy a particularly interesting topic to research, because we have to really rework and clarify several things there. Namely, normally what I tried to convey today is that object-oriented ontology should and can do by means of the ontology only the aesthetic as a sort of object, as an attribute of the object. However, what they do is they define it as a relation of whatever kind. So there's really a crisscrossing of objectives here, and I think this makes it for me quite a intriguing topic to deal with.
Okay, thank you. Ian, you have a comment, please?
I mean, yes, I understand the question that Nick asked, and also I would like to comment on Swan's reply. Really, I think there is a variety of routes that we can go there, and what could happen with this particular route is that it could become quite vacuous. It could become something, in the end, it becomes a meaningless, self-fulfilling kind of nonsensical kind of examination. And what would worry me really is that, and this is the problem I think with some parts of speculative philosophy, is that in the end, it's a kind of so what. So, really at the end of the day, you go, and so what? I would suggest, and I've said this to you before, Swan, I think there needs to be some empirical content here. You need to, if you want to look at the relations and you want to understand these relationships, then the only way to take this forward in any meaningful way is to make it an empirical examination. And I think then in those circumstances, and because the great thing about dress and clothing is that it's something concrete. Use its qualities, use its actual attributes as a way of moving the field forward. Otherwise, it will go round and round and round and round. And in the end, it becomes, as I say, for me, meaningless. Thank you.
Can I react?
Of course, please.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Ian. Very interesting to call it vacuous. I really like that. I have a feeling that since I am dealing with the aesthetic, that the aesthetic has this characteristic that it always, in a way, is at the brink of escaping. Always, I feel that when we do philosophy about aesthetic, that it's at the risk of going into, okay, but why do I do that? What again was I thinking about? What again was I talking about? And it might be that also the European camp of speculative philosophy, namely speculative narration, has the proper methodology in order to do aesthetics in a philosophical sense. But this I still have to explore, because I just started finding the speculative narration camp. And yeah, what you said about I need the empirical content, certainly on the one hand I agree with you, and that's why I mean, I did my PhD on the clothing, so now I want to do an aesthetics of the clothing, so I really want to build on the work I did so far. That's the idea. But on the other hand, I'm also feeling that if the aesthetic is ontological, then how do we get the empirical? How are we not just researching the two different things? But I do want to find a way to really connect these two, and yeah, I want to do a bit of marketing in a way, because I recently found a very interesting artistic project that is happening here in Berlin. It's called New Dawn, and they basically are doing a speculative aesthetics by means of gloves. So I think, Ian, for you and for me, this could be a pretty cool empirical project to get engaged with. And yeah, I'm still in contact with them, and I really hope that they will fodder my abstract aesthetic thinking with the proper empirical artistic content.
Okay, thank you, Swantje. There's a suggestion from Amkuta Maria Mortu in the detail in the chat window for a book of from Jean-Marie Schaeffer, Aesthetic Relationship, Cognition, and the Pleasures of Art. Thank you, Ankuta, for suggesting this.
I'll have a look at it. Thank you.
Okay. I'm really looking forward to your stay in Prešov, because me being a Kantian one, we have things to discuss.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Please, if there are some other question or comment, feel free to ask or to write it down. If not, I would like to thank both speakers for these wonderful talks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And